Good evening.
Good evening.
It's nice to see such a turnout in this room. The last time that I was here, we did one of these. It was myself and 4 people. So I think if we go how we do it, we owe this to Peter's presence.
Up to the topic.
Anyway, it's a combination of both. So let me just, Peter probably doesn't need any introduction to most of us, but just let me say that he's an islander here. He, among important things, he plays a lot of golf and does a lot of sailing. And he's lived here, I don't know, for how many years, Peter?
40.
40 years. He lives in the Heights, and he was present for most of these events that lead up to where we are today. He was a lawyer in Moscow for 20 years, from 1991, which is about the date of the fall of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, if I recall correctly, until 2010. So he saw a lot of these things, and even after that, he's been an arbitrator in Moscow and Kyiv with many of the players from these countries. So Peter is well versed to understand much better than us what went on there. And so with that, Peter, I'll just, will we turn it over to the video?
Yeah, we're going to have a short video just to introduce the subject. This is something that Great Decisions has done historically. This year they cut out that policy, but I found a fairly short video that I think pretty well sets the stage.
Next.
All right, I think that sort of sets the stage. What I'd like to do now is to step back a bit and deal with what I see as been the trends over the 75 years since World War II. But first I'd like to do a little geography. And so, Gary,
I don't know where we're getting the good music from, but let's get rid of that. Okay. Okay. All right.
All right, a little geography first. Russia is a very, very large country. You've probably heard discussions about the 11 time zones. That's one way to look at it, but a better way, I think, is to just consider the following. If you fly from New York to Moscow, it's about a 9-hour flight, and you fly over the Atlantic and most of continental Europe to get to Moscow. But if you fly from Moscow to Petropavlovsk on the peninsula of Kamchatka, and I'll show you over here, it's also a 9-hour flight, but you're flying over one country. It's a huge country. This map is also very interesting because here's Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is the largest land country in Europe, but Ukraine is small compared to Russia. Russia is a very, very big country. Let's go to the Ukrainian map. Now, here's Ukraine. Later in this event, we'll talk about the war, but I just wanted to give you a view of the geography of Ukraine. Ukraine, as you may have read in some of the things that I set out, particularly the piece by the Yale professor, Tim Snyder, has a very tortured history, but there are essentially 3 areas. The first area is eastern Ukraine. And that's the area that borders Russia. The people who live there are basically Russian speaking, and it is also the industrial part of Ukraine. The Donbass is the area in sort of red and in blue. It is, as I say, closely aligned with Russia, geographically connected to Russia. The middle part, Kiev, which is on the Don River that flows down to the Black Sea, essentially Russian speaking. It is the political capital. It's also the economic capital of Ukraine. And then coming further over, Lviv, which has been in the television and press recently because many of the people fleeing from the war area have gone to Lviv. Lviv was that area was part of Poland for many, many years. There's basically no Russian speaking there. It's all Ukrainian speaking. But that just in a very quick way gives you a view of Ukraine as essentially three separate geographic areas. Let's go to the next slide. This is the graph. Now, we've also handed it out to you. This is the 75 years of history of our relations with Russia. We were allies, as you know, in World War II. You may recall the famous meeting between the Soviet troops and the American troops on the River Elbe in 1945. But very, very quickly, that relationship disappeared. Churchill, in a speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, coined the phrase the Iron Curtain. He said that from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain is falling down. And we entered very, very quickly the Cold War. Highlights of the Cold War included the Berlin airlift, when we brought food and aid to the Berliners who were in eastern Germany, completely surrounded by the Soviet troops. World War II, you might call it a war in the Cold War that we fought. We obviously fought the Chinese and the North Koreans, but the Russians were certainly, and the Soviets were certainly behind all of it. And things stayed pretty cold for a long period of time. Probably the lowest point in that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think almost many of us in this room remember very distinctly the Cuban Missile Crisis. Later studies not so long ago in the past of what happened, demonstrated that the Soviets had in fact lifted their rockets into positions to be fired from Cuba to the eastern part of the United States. If that had happened, we would have had World War III. We came extraordinarily close to having World War III in 1963. But thanks to quiet diplomacy that took place at the time, Khrushchev ordered the ships traveling to Cuba with missiles to turn around, and he ordered the missiles that were in Cuba to be sent back to the Soviet Union. At the same time, we took down missiles that we had stationed in Turkey that were aimed at the Soviet Union. But we came really within a hair of having World War III happen at that time. The Cold War continued. There were periods of some cooperation. There were cultural exchanges. Van Cliburn won the piano competition and the Tchaikovsky competition during this period of time. So there was a fair amount of going back and forth, but we were still enemies. It was still the Cold War. But things began to loosen up. In 1974, the U.S.-Soviet Trade Council was formed. I was its lawyer at the time of its formation and for its 20 years of existence. And there were more and more trips going back and forth. Some business was being done. But the business situation really didn't take off until Gorbachev came into power in 1985. And you may recall the term perestroika, which is basically redoing the business arrangements. Joint ventures were allowed with foreign investment, and very soon after the joint ventures took place or were allowed, wholly owned investments were allowed. And that's when you saw the Coca-Colas, the McDonald's, Ford Motor Company, and many other companies come into Russia, set up operations, set up manufacturing plants, set up bottling operations, and many other forms of direct investment. And the very big oil joint ventures took place at that time. ExxonMobil had several joint ventures on Sakhalin Island, Chevron joint ventures in the Caspian, and Total and BP. These are huge companies, and they made huge investments in Russia. So you could go along and you could stop at the gas station, the BP gas station, and get your gas, just as you can coming here to Shell Round. Stop at BP. And it was the highlight. You can see the graph going up very, very precipitously. In 1991, however, Gorbachev was overthrown and Yeltsin came into power. And one of the first things that Yeltsin and the presidents of Ukraine and Belarus did was they signed a treaty eliminating, doing away with the Soviet Union. And you may know that Putin has said that the destruction of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy, economic tragedy of the 20th century. And he certainly has said that. We, on the other hand, I think here, viewed it as a very positive development, that we now would deal with Russia, we would deal with Ukraine, we would deal with the other former republics in the Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan. The 1990s, the decade that Yeltsin was president, was very chaotic in Russia. I recall seeing old people standing on sidewalks with their household goods, selling their household goods so that they could have enough money to live. It was also a time when there were many business assassinations that took place. It was a period of chaos. However, on January 1, 2000, Yeltsin installed Putin as the president. And the decade that followed, from 2000 to 2010, was a time when investment continued. I think there was a great development of the middle class during that period of time. There was more stability. A middle class used to driving cars, buying Ford Motor Company cars, or buying Peugeots and other cars, Western cars that came in. Oh, and including the Mercedes, very, very popular car in Russia, to say the least. And the Maybach, which is the ultimate of the Mercedes line, very popular in Russia. You saw the development of the middle class, but you also saw the rise of the oligarchs and people like Khodorkovsky, who controlled the Yukos oil company. You saw media empires. Kaczynski had a very big media empire. Berezovsky, likewise, a huge media empire. There was still a fracturing of, you might say, society, but it was becoming, in our view, a much more open, free, democratic society, a great deal of tourism that took place. In my own case, I opened a law office in Moscow in 1991 with a Russian lawyer, and we had a paralegal, and our rent was $7 a month, and the paralegal cooked lunch. It was great. But that office expanded and became much more an ordinary office, and by the time I left Moscow in 2010, we had 30 lawyers on staff, all of whom were Russian, and another 30 on staff. So we had an office of about 60 people, and modern communications equipment. We were connected with other offices of my firm than Hogan Lovells, and things were going well. But there were dark clouds on the horizon. And if we can have the next slide, we'll come back to this graph in a second. These dark clouds were, of course, the perception. This is a wonderful 19th century picture of three bogatirs, or warriors, and they're standing on the edge of Russia, and they're looking out at the enemy. The enemy is advancing on Russia. NATO was advancing. NATO, during this period of time, expanded to countries of the former Warsaw Pact: Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and indeed the three Baltic states that had been part of the Soviet Union joined NATO during this period of time. I have to say parenthetically that the United States never recognized the annexation of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They were always considered to be not part of the Soviet Union by our standard. And I think even when just before the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think that Gorbachev...
Can we ask everyone to mute again?
Yes, would you, all who are watching on Zoom, please mute? We're getting some extraneous sounds. Thank you. That they were never really considered to be part of the Soviet Union, although they were formally part of the Soviet Union. But so, looking out, Putin and his allies, including Patrushev and others, saw an expanding NATO coming closer and closer. And then, of course, in 2008, there was discussion about Georgia, a republic of the former Soviet Union, and Ukraine joining NATO. And this, I think, represented the end of this peak, this ascension. We can go back to the chart. The peak, and things then started to go down. starting really in about 2010. In 2011, there were protests in Bolotnaya Square, which is a square very near the Kremlin, and protesters were waving white handkerchiefs. The revolution that took place in Georgia in 2008 was the Rose Revolution. Things started to go down. For example, Americans, again, would you please mute if you're watching on Zoom? Everyone should be on mute, so we don't have these extra call.
I tried to find the person so I can mute them.
Yes, we're going to find you and mute
Find you
you.
and YouTube.
Americans were no longer allowed to adopt babies. USAID had a very large operation in Russia, was kicked out. So as you can see, the slope is going down. It's going down precipitously. The next major event was in 2014, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine that toppled the government there. The president, Yanukovych, fled to Russia and today is still in Russia. But Putin and Patrushev and others looking out saw American influence on that. Victoria Nuland, a very high-ranking member of the State Department, was in Ukraine at the time, and there are pictures of her in Maidan Square, which is the central square on the Krещатик in downtown Kiev, handing out sandwiches and coffee to the protesters. It was a violent protest. About 100 people were killed. That was what led to the ouster of the regime and the exile of Yanukovych. Following that, the United States imposed a great deal of sanctions on Russia. Shortly thereafter, we of course had the interference in our 2016 elections, and following that, there was a great expulsion of diplomats on both sides and a great number of sanctions. Many of those sanctions were levied against people in the two major military operations that are involved in cyber, the GRU and the SVR. So many of those individuals were sanctioned. And as I say, relations, you can see by the graph, are going down very precipitously. And then, of course, we get to this year, February 24. On February 23, I did not think that there would be an invasion of Ukraine because the consequences would be so dramatic. And they were, and they are. So the invasion took place on the 24th of February of this year. Russian troops moved into Ukraine very quickly. They thought that they were going to capture Kyiv within a matter of days. Sort of parenthetically, some of the general officers who were involved in that phase brought their dress uniforms because they expected that they would have a nice parade in downtown Krещатик in Kiev shortly thereafter. But as you know, the Ukrainians fought back. The whole West was unified, sending equipment, sending financial support. You saw the video. That video really is a little bit dated, but it does show what has happened subsequent to February. We are in a situation right now where it is getting very dangerous. I think we are probably as close to the point we were in 1963, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that things could escalate. They could escalate very quickly and get out of control. The sanctions we have levied have been very, very severe, but what I think has been the most remarkable thing has been the withdrawal of American and Western companies from Russia. And this has not only been the small companies, but as you know, McDonald's that had about almost close to 1,000 stores in Russia pulled out, basically sold his business to one of its franchisees. Even the major oil companies that had billions of dollars of investment have withdrawn. So ExxonMobil has withdrawn, Chevron has withdrawn, Total, BP, they've all pulled out. And that to me is a remarkable development because many of these companies invested a great deal of money in Russia, developed very close relations with their employees, felt very loyal to their employees, and many of them, as you probably have read, are supporting their employees even though they are withdrawing. This withdrawal will last a very long time. Whatever happens to U.S. and Ukraine and U.S. and Russia, I think it will be a long time before many of these companies will come back in. As I say, while I consider the sanctions to be very interesting and potentially effective, I think that the withdrawal of American and European businesses from Russia is very significant. As you know, things are developing as we speak. So Putin went to Tehran and has met the Ayatollah, and interestingly, the president of Turkey was also part of it, Mr. Erdogan. One of the reasons that the Chinese and the Indians have not been supplying military equipment to Russia, which Russia desperately needs, is the threat of secondary sanctions. A secondary sanction is when the United States sanctions companies in third countries who are aiding, in this case, Russia. And it's the threat of secondary sanctions, the threat of removing the opportunity for those companies, let's say in China, to do business in the United States, has kept them from providing material aid to Russia. On the other hand, the secondary sanctions do not affect Iran. Iran is already heavily sanctioned, so the Iranian companies can do what they want to do. The Iranian government can do what they want to do. Secondary sanctions will not stop them because they are already so heavily sanctioned. So we have a situation where the West at this moment seems to be quite united, largely because of the horrific activities of the Russians in Ukraine. Let's go back to that Ukrainian slide. And we'll stay with this slide for a while.
Okay.
And we will soon, I will soon open it up to questions and answers and a dialogue.
Bear with me.
Sure.
We'll get there eventually. There we go.
Here we are. So as I understand it, at this point, the Kharkiv, which is the subject right now of a lot of bombardment, as is most of the rest of Ukraine, but the Russians control this area, and they're moving down from Mariupol. They're trying to move to a point where they can have direct access to Crimea. Crimea has a tremendous water problem, and the Russians have been trying to provide water to Crimea. But if they are able to take this area, Mariupol and Kherson, they will have direct access to Crimea. Parenthetically, you probably know that Sevastopol is the home base of the Russian Black Fleet. So one of the reasons that Crimea was annexed in 2014 was to secure the base of its major fleet on the Black Sea. That annexation took place in 2014. So in 2014, Crimea became part of the Russian Federation. And you may have read recently that there are probably moves to make Luhansk and Donetsk also part of the Russian Federation, and it's possible to make this entire area part of the Russian Federation. This is territorial aggression, clearly. Now, Odessa, which is a major port on the Black Sea of Ukraine, at the moment is blocked by Russian fleets, and also it's heavily mined by the Ukrainians. So it's very hard to get any goods in and out. But Africa today is suffering greatly because it has been dependent on Ukrainian and Russian grain. And at the moment, the sanctions that have been levied against Russia prevent the financing of exports of grain, and the fact that this is being blocked prevents grain from coming up. But I think that fairly shortly we will see a resolution, at least in that part, and that grain will flow to Africa from both Russia and Ukraine, and avert a catastrophic situation in Africa, which is on the verge of really suffering from famine. So there we have it. We have a situation where today it appears that there's somewhat of a break, at least in the ground forces, but certainly not in the aerial attacks. And even cities as far west as Lviv are still being bombed. Odessa is being bombed. Kyiv is being bombed. I contacted one of my fellow arbitrators, a Ukrainian, very, very recently, and asked her how it was going on. And she said, well, I'm in the office, but then I have to go to a bomb shelter from time to time. So it's very serious. So that shows us, the graph shows the great rise up to 2010, and then there's this crashing down, and as I say, I think we're at the lowest point that we've been at since somewhat the same level as we were at in 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Two concluding points. One is that 90% of all atomic weapons are controlled by the United States and Russia. It's only about 10% are in the hands of other countries. It's a sobering thing. There are two ironies I want to conclude with. The first irony is that Putin has compared himself to Peter the Great. Peter the Great opened Russia to the West at the beginning of the 18th century. Putin, in the 21st century, is closing Russia to the West. The other irony is, of course, the one about NATO. NATO, as you may know, certainly during the Trump presidency, was rocky grounds. There was even rumor that the United States might pull out of NATO. NATO's most recent missions were in Libya and earlier in the Balkans. NATO has been revitalized. NATO's original mission from 1949 was to confront the Soviet Union. NATO's mission today is to confront Russia. It was also, Putin's objective was to stop this advance of NATO coming towards Russia. Now, assuming that the Turks concede and allow, or do not block Finland and Sweden from joining NATO, NATO will be really right at the border of Russia. Finland has about an 850-mile border with Russia, so NATO will be right on that border. So the irony was the war to stop the advancement has done nothing but revitalize the mission of NATO and move NATO much, much closer to Russia. Now, you've all been reading all sorts of articles recently. This is a very unclear, very muddy picture. But since the Great Decisions program is one where there's dialogue, I would like to open up the floor to questions, comments, and whatever, not only from those who are here, but also those online. Terry, if someone wants to raise a question online, what should he or she do?
They should unmute themselves and say, I have a question, because I can't see all of your faces because I want to keep the map up so we can talk. Okay. So since I can't see you, I'll just say I have a question, and your face will appear and you can do your question.
Peter, let me, as the moderator, take advantage of that position to put the first question to you. So one of the debates that has gone on has been about the expansion of NATO, which you referred to. And it started back in 1991 when Germany was reunified. And we agreed with the Russians at that time that Eastern Germany would become part of the Federal Republic of Germany, and they would join NATO, and that in return for that, there would be no troops or arms put into Eastern Germany. And then in 1997, when it expanded again, and Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were added, there was a large debate within the U.S. as well as within Europe and Russia as to whether it was a good thing to expand NATO. And there were many, including George Kennan, who wrote the telegram from Moscow setting the whole basis for their containment policy, said this is a huge mistake, the expansion, because the Russians are traditionally insecure in their relations with the West, and they will see this as an aggressive move. In which they thought at the time that some U.S. policymakers had said that wouldn't happen, but they'd see it as an aggressive move. And George Kennan said, in fact, what will happen is Russia will eventually respond aggressively to that. And George Kennan predicted. And at the time that Russia does respond aggressively to it, those who support expansion will say, see, we told you, Russia's always been aggressive. But in fact, George Kennan's point was they would not have been if we had not expanded. So, and then we continued the expansion with, as you said, with the Baltic states and others, and it actually prompted a war from Putin back in 2008 in Georgia, when they said they would let Georgia in. He invaded Georgia in order to stop that. So where do you come down on this? Do you think that those who say that the expansion of NATO is what's caused this aggression?
Well, I think there's a very good argument that that is the case, but we're in a totally different situation today with horrific actions which are captured by videos and news reports and all. I mean, the brutality that's going on in Ukraine is amazing. Yes, I think it would have been a very good idea if NATO had not expanded. I mean, I think Russia probably would have just stayed where it was, but that's water over the dam, as they say, and we're in a totally different situation today.
Others?
Yes.
Thank you. As I understand it, when Russia seized Crimea in 2014, heavy sanctions were leveled against them, and with this current invasion, Russia has seen a new wave of sanctions. This combined with their isolation now from China and India, who are unwilling to supply armed assistance to them, do you think that Putin will be able to remain president for all this? This is very damaging, obviously, to his regime.
Well, I tend to side with the article in Foreign Affairs that was part of the reading for today, that this is not the same as it was 20 years ago. And I think that Russia is much stronger, despite the sanctions and all. I think that everything will be decided on the battlefield. I mean, my view is that if Ukraine, supplied by Western arms, is able to hold the Russians to where they are today, and I'm not quite sure about the area just above Crimea, but if it's able to hold that and we are able to sustain what I think is going to be a very, very strong push by many Western European countries, Germany in particular, but also other countries that are dependent on Russian gas to heat themselves. If we're able to sustain this, we might get to a more permanent stalemate. And then possibly a modus vivendi that could occur at that time. But we're at such a fragile point now where you probably read that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, had said, you know, the West supplying all these more sophisticated howitzers, the ones that can shoot 60 miles, 80 miles, and all, may make us do more than we said we were going to do. That is, annex more territory. And of course, you have Zelensky and others saying, we will not give up any of our territory. So I mean, we have a situation where you've got one side saying, we're going to take more territory, we're going to annex land and make it part of Russia. You've got the other side saying, we're going to push Russia back to the borders that existed at least at 2014. I must say, I'm not so sure about Crimea. Crimea, as you know, was historically Russian. It was sort of Newport, Rhode Island, to the eastern part of the United States at the end of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. Those who went to Newport built the cottages, the nobility and the czars built their palaces. On Crimea, there was a direct railroad line from Moscow down to Crimea at the latter part of the 19th century. I think the Russians have considered Crimea to be theirs, whereas much of this area that I've referred to on the border of Russia has never been historically Russian. And it is much harder for Russia to say, well, we're going to take this land and we're going to make it ours. Sue.
So Peter, when you speak about Russia saying that they're going to do this, is it just Putin, or is there a whole group in the Duma that is going to?
There's only one person who counts, and that's Putin.
Okay. So who if something happens to Putin?
Well, Nikolai Patrushev, who in fact is older than Putin and was superior to Putin in the early years, during the Yeltsin period, but was jumped over by Yeltsin to become president. He has a strong following, and I think that ideologically he is maybe even farther to the extreme than Putin. So I think that if Putin disappears from the scene, that there will be others who will step in. And unlike the situation that happened during the Gorbachev years, when Gorbachev was in fact overthrown, Putin has been very careful to make sure that protests, like the protests in Bolotnaya Square of 2011, were suppressed. And as you know, following the special military operation in Ukraine, he has made it very clear that there can be no dissent. So you've read in the paper of people getting prison terms of up to 7 years, even longer, fines and all. I think most people in Russia are just putting their heads down and just not looking around. As you know, many of the younger people of your age and all have left Russia. Many of them have gone to Western countries, but some who didn't have the funds or the ability to go to Western countries have gone to places like Armenia or Lithuania. And so the high-tech industries of Lithuania and Armenia have been increased tremendously by the influx of the young people. For the older people, there's no possibility. They're just staying there, and they're putting their heads down. Yes?
Why is Ukraine not part of NATO? As I always heard that it was very corrupt and that they want them to clean their act up first.
Yes. There are many factors in admitting a country to NATO and even to the EU. As you know, Ukraine has been granted candidate status for admission to the EU, but there's no talk about admitting it to NATO. I mean, some people may be wishing it, but there's no plan to do that. No, Ukraine, until very recently, we viewed as rather corrupt, that it didn't have the types of democratic institutions in place that would enable it to join either the EU or NATO. Zelensky has done a marvelous job, and as you know, his wife addressed Congress yesterday, received a standing ovation. He is quite an actor. Oh, by the way, if you are most interested, on Netflix, there is this wonderful series called Servant of the People. It's Zelensky playing a president before he became a president as an actor. Oligarchs wanted him to become the president. This is the television series. The oligarchs in the television series wanted him to become president, and so they put him in. And it's a comedy. It should be watched. As I say, it's on Netflix. It's in Russian with subtitles.
I see that Alistair is unmuted. Alistair, did you have a question?
Yes, I had a question on Luhansk and Donetsk. You said that they all are Russian-speaking, and yet they are not and never were part of Russia. What are the large majority of the people thinking there? Are they saying we've been invaded, or are they saying, oh, at last the Russians have come and saved us because we're basically Russian culture?
Thank you, Alistair, for that question. I think before February 24 of this year, I think many of them would have said we're really Russian. We have a strong affinity for Russia. Sorry, we're Ukrainian, but we have a strong affinity for Russia. We like to speak the Russian language. We hope our children are educated in the Russian language. After February 24, that whole attitude has changed greatly. The bombings, much of the bombings and destruction have taken place in Luhansk and Donetsk, and I think that now the sentiment is very anti-Russian in those areas. As I say, the battlefield determines many things.
So what is the end game if they don't want to become part of Russia?
Well, I think that
Putin manage them.
Well, I think that that there will be you might say, a fake election. I think that there will be an election in both those oblasts, regions, and they will vote overwhelmingly to join Russia. And Russia will very quickly put it through its parliament, the Duma, and they will become part of the Russian Federation. But what happens thereafter is going to be a very, very big question. I think there will be a lot of partisan activity. I think that Russia will have a very difficult time controlling. I mean, it's one thing to control a relatively small area like South Ossetia, which is part of Georgia, but it's another thing to try to control a significant population in Ukraine. So it may be an X, but it will be a messy situation going forward. But as I said initially, we have this real problem of, on the one hand, Zelensky and others want to regain all that territory. On the other hand, we have Putin and his people saying we want to expand beyond that territory. So you've got this situation where the aims are completely opposite. And we have been trying to draw lines that say that we're not invading Russia. We're not hurting Russia by our advanced equipment. And boy, that seems to me is a very, very tricky thing. I mean, where do you draw the line? You draw the line at howitzers that can bomb 80 miles away. What happens if, many of these are being used solely in Donetsk and Luhansk and other parts of occupied Ukraine. But suppose some of them are now aimed at farther to the east and go into Russia. And so our military equipment is now being used to bomb areas in Russia itself. Is that the start of World War III? Is that a provocation enough? I mean, Ukraine would say these are terribly important sites because they're ammunition supply areas for inflicting damage to Ukraine. We shouldn't be restricted to keeping the use of our military equipment supplied by, of course, the West to strictly areas of Ukraine. We need to go further into Russia. Well, those questions are yet before us.
Peter, let me ask you, just that you raised the question of what should the U.S. policy be? I mean, we have this war going on, and it's going to become a war of attrition. It's going to require a lot of material support, both from us and for other countries. But right now, what I've read is that the material support that we've approved so far is only going to last into the second quarter of next year. The war looks like it'll go on long beyond that. And so the issue is, we have said that we will support Ukraine as long as they want to fight it. But do we really mean that? Should we be behind the scenes trying to resolve the war in some lesser fashion? Because one of the worst outcomes that you can get is that we have to look to the future and the relationship between Russia and Europe and ourselves in the future. And if we continue to push the Russians away, we'll end up with the West on one side and Russia with an alliance with China, India, Indonesia, who knows what other countries on the other side. And that probably is the worst outcome. So do you have any thoughts on how we should be handling this?
Yeah, I hate to go back to my mantra, but the battlefield will determine everything. I think that the best that we can hope for is a stalemate where these two opposing forces at least agree to live together. We, as an example, still do not have a treaty ending the Korean War. The Korean War is now 70 years old, and we still don't have that. What should our policy be? I think morally we certainly need to support the Ukrainians. I mean, this is aggression, territorial aggression, and we don't want to see that. And I know that those that are closest to Russia in the West are saying the same thing. If territory is seized in Ukraine, maybe Moldova becomes next. Maybe Poland suffers. So I think we need to think of the future consequences. But how far do we go is the real issue. I mean, we don't want to inflict a World War III. We don't want to get into a situation where this thing expands. I think our policy should be to try as best we can to see a resolution of this. And I think the other driving force will be, of course, Germany and the other countries that import gas. And if they suffer greatly during this coming winter, and notwithstanding the heat today, it could be very cold in January, we need to take that into account. That is to say, we need to try to continue to maintain our support of sanctions and others uniformly across Western Europe and the United States. I don't think we want to lose that. So that should be an aim, which I think can be managed. The war is a very tricky thing because, as I say, if using our equipment, there are incursions into Russia itself to try to stop the war from being supplied by Russia. That's very tricky.
You remember when Secretary of Defense Austin said that our goal is to weaken Russia so they can never do that again. And there were people in Europe who said, oh no, we don't want to have that kind of continuing goal that is going to foster this war and actually become, a Western war with Russia as opposed to a Ukrainian war with Russia. And but maybe that really is the goal of the United States.
The problem
Should it
is we don't necessarily have uniform approaches. We have different approaches. I think one of the reasons that NATO expanded, was allowed to expand to areas that were formerly part of the Warsaw Pact, was that there was strong support for that, principally among people who had emigrated from those countries to the United States and were, some of them, elected to Congress. And they were pushing for the expansion of NATO and not listening to the likes of George Kennan. So what should be our approach? I think our approach should be to try to contain this to a point where it doesn't expand into World War III. And I think the secondary aspect should be to maintain our alliance with Western Europe to keep the sanctions being uniform. If we break on the sanctions and that goes, that is a loss of great pressure. I do think that the sanctions will take time to work, but I think certainly among the middle class, the lawyers in my firm, for example, feel very, very much affected by the sanctions. They cannot travel to the West. They cannot send their children to public schools in England to be educated. And their airplanes will not be able to fly because Boeing and Airbus will not be able to send spare parts. So travel will diminish. They will not be able to buy furniture at IKEA or buy Western cars. I mean, it's a step way back. And I think that we need to keep the sanctions on in a uniform way across our alliance with Western Europe to keep that type of pressure, because eventually it will help. It may not solve the problem, but I think it will help. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, two questions. They're very different. The first question is what's the intellectual community? What are the universities in Russia doing? Is there a modern Sakharov or someone like that? That's question number one.
Yeah.
And question number two is the whole question of China. And I wonder to what degree the US is in fact in extensive discussions with China with regard to Russia. It might be more of a question for Kirk.
Okay, as to the first, I think that those in the universities are keeping their heads down. I mean, I think that many of them, if they spoke up, would be fired and possibly subjected to financial and possibly criminal penalties. So I think they are keeping their heads down and pretending that this war doesn't exist. After all, it's just a special military operation. It's not a war, according to them. It must be awful to be in the universities at the present time. I know that most American lawyers have left Russia. One colleague got out just as the war was beginning, and he told me that he was flying on Aeroflot, and the plane had entered Danish airspace and turned around and went back to Russia. And he had to leave through Dubai on one of the airlines there. So yes, many Americans have left. I have a multiple entry visa to Russia that's good for another 2 years or so. I don't think I'll be using it.
It'd be against the sanctions, wouldn't it?
I think travel, well,
No?
you've got to be very careful what you do. Why are you going over there? What are you going to do over there? Are you going to help them? So yeah, no.
On China, what I know about China is they've had recent discussions.
Who's the they? Sorry, Russian?
I'm sorry, the State Department.
Okay.
State Department. And at a very high level. And they're doing their best to try to bring China along. Not only China, but also India, Brazil, Argentina, some of these big countries that are on the fence. But they're not getting anywhere. And I haven't seen any indications that they're getting anywhere. Now, Peter made the comment that the Chinese are not selling arms to the Russians because of the threat of secondary sanctions. And I think that may be the case. The drones are coming from Iran as we read. Peter, I don't know, do you have anything to add about China?
No, but I do want to say that China and India are purchasing a great deal of oil from Russia. They're paying a discounted price but I heard the figure, this is about $800 million a day goes to the Russian treasury as a result of these sales. China and India both desperately need oil, and they're getting it. They're getting it at a discounted price, but the discounted price is so relatively high given the fact that oil prices have skyrocketed.
But Paulie, but your question's a very good one, because as I said before, I mean, one of the things that we really want to avoid as we look down the road is pushing Russia into a really tight relationship with China and perhaps India. And then we have a world divided along those lines for many decades into the future.
It's interesting, it's sort of a recreation of Soviet influence, but looking to the west, looking to the east instead of the west. Yes, Paul.
Is there any truth to the stories that Putin's mental and physical health is deteriorating?
Well, there was a period of time when, because of COVID, he took extraordinarily severe precautions. If you wanted to meet with him, you had to go into isolation for 2 weeks beforehand, and you had to go through some sort of chamber, and he was doing no traveling at all. He's now traveling. Say, he's just been in Tehran, and he seems to be a lot happier these days. I think the first period he was extraordinarily worried, and now he's seeing that there's a possibility of success because the West will not hold out. The West will fracture, particularly in the winter when they need Russian gas, and things look better from his perspective, notwithstanding the sanctions, notwithstanding the isolation. Also, you may recall in the book, the article dealing with Russia, the Foreign Affairs article, talked about Russia being sort of 3 or 4 different Russias. And you have the small elite Russia, the middle class, but you have other segments of Russia that are really not terribly interested in uniting with the West, and they're just happy to go along and lead their lives. So I think this means that we could be in for a very long period of protracted warfare. But I think it's in our strongest interest to try to see this thing wrapped up before the Western alliance crashes and before we have a situation that could lead to a World War III.
And Peter, could you comment on, I have read that actually the Russian management of their economy has actually been quite good in terms of supporting the ruble, keeping their reserves in place, and I think they've avoided default on their debts up to now, haven't they?
Well, up to now, technically, because of the sanctions, the elimination of SWIFT from many of the banks, that they could be in technical default. But you are correct. The two people, Elvira Nabiulina, who is the head of the central bank, and Sulianov, who's, I guess, the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury, have done a very good job in managing the economy and made it possible for Russia to continue along as it has been continuing. But I share your concern about Russia going into sort of an alliance with these other countries, India, Indonesia, China, Iran, and the world gets divided in half again. Just the border is now the border separating the East from the West.
Peter, let me ask you one more question, if I may. What do you make of the argument that one of the reasons why, I mean, in the news clip, somebody said, it didn't happen under Trump, and it couldn't happen under Trump, and the proof is because it didn't. And then there are those though who say that one of the reasons why he did this was that the U.S. response in the past has been so weak, that it was weak when the Russians went into Syria. We had the red line. If they used chemical weapons, that we would respond. We didn't. It was very weak after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. All of this took place under Obama, and so Putin thought perhaps he had a free hand.
Well, I think he may have thought that the situation in Crimea, the annexation, or the invasion of Crimea and its subsequent annexation, was a model for what would happen to Ukraine. You may recall that the troops moved in without insignias on their uniforms. They were called the Little Green Men, and within a matter of days they had kicked the Ukrainians out of Crimea and annexed it. I think that that thinking was Ukraine was fractured between the east and the west, and that they would be able to move in and have their victory parade down in Krashatik a few days later. They were wrong.